Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. I hope you and your family are doing well. Let's continue our lesson on ER modeling part 2. In this part, we will take a look at attributes, attribute types, strong and weak entities, and attribute on relationship. Okay, first is about attributes. Attribute is a property of, a characteristic of, or a fact that we know about an entity. For example, a staff entity type may be described by the staff number, name, position, and salary attributes. Each attribute also must have a domain. Attribute domain is the set of allowable values for one or more attributes. The attributes hold values that describe each entity occurrence and represent the main part of the data stored in the database. There are 5 types of attributes, which are simple attribute, composite attribute, single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, and derived attributes. Simple attributes is an attribute composed of a single component with an independent existence. It cannot be further subdivided into smaller components, for example, magic number. Composite attribute is an attribute composed of multiple components, each with an independent existence. Some attributes can be further divided to yield smaller components. For example, address can be divided into street, city, and postcode. Okay, next is single value attribute. It is an attribute that holds a single value for each occurrence of an entity type. For example, subject name. Only one value can be attached to the attribute, and majority of attributes are single valued. Okay, for multi-valued attribute, it is an attribute that holds multiple values for each occurrence of an entity type. For example, email or phone number. Students may have multiple email address or phone number. And last type is derived attribute. It is an attribute that represents a value that is derivable from the value of a related attribute or set of attributes not necessarily in the same entity type. For example, the total number of student attribute of the student entity type can be calculated by counting the total number of student entity occurrences. Same goes with age. We can calculate the age from the DOB. Okay, so next we talk about the attributes that identified as keys. For example, candidate key, composite key, and primary key. First is candidate key. Candidate key is a minimal set of attributes that uniquely identifies each occurrence of an entity type. In addition, candidate key is a minimal superkey with no redundancy. Second is composite key. Composite key is a candidate key that consists of 2 or more attributes. And next is primary key. Primary key is a candidate key selected to uniquely identify each occurrence of an entity type. We may identify more than one candidate key. However, we must choose one of the candidate keys to be the primary key. Normally, we will choose the single attribute as a primary key. This figure shows the ER diagram for the staff and branch entity types and their associated attributes. The first attribute to be listed is the primary key for the entity type. As shown in this figure, the primary key of the staff entity type is the staff number attribute, and the primary key of the branch entity type is the branch number attribute. For simple single value attributes, there is no need to use tags, so we simply display the attribute names in a list below the entity name. For composite attributes, we list the name of the composite attribute followed below and intended to the right by the names of its simple component attributes. For multi-valued attributes, we label the attribute name with an indication of the range of values available for the attribute. For example, we label the telephone number attribute with the range 1.3. This means that the telephone number attribute holds 1 to a maximum of 3 values. And for derived attributes, we prefix the attribute name with a slash symbol. For example, the derived attributes of the staff entity type is shown in this figure as slash total staff. So next, we will go further on the strong and weak entity types. Strong entity type is entity type that is not existence dependent on some other entity type, while weak entity type is entity type that is existence dependent on some other entity type. A characteristic of a strong entity type is that each entity occurrence is uniquely identifiable using the primary key attributes of that entity type, while a characteristic of a weak entity is that each entity occurrence cannot be uniquely identified using only the attributes associated with that entity type. In addition, strong entity types are sometimes referred to as parents, owner, or dominant entities, and weak entity types as child, dependent, or subordinate. Okay, for example, in this slide, we have a strong entity type called client and a weak entity type called preference. We can uniquely identify each preference only through the relationship that a preference has with a client who is uniquely identifiable using the primary key for the client entity type, which is client number. Preference entity cannot exist if the client entity does not exist. So next, we move on to the next slide, which is relationship with attributes. And for your information, attributes can also be assigned to relationship. Actually, the presence of one or more attributes assigned to a relationship may indicate that the relationship conceals an unidentified entity type. This slide shows an example of a relationship called advertise, which attributes date Edward and cost. We represent attributes associated with a relationship type using the same symbol as an entity type. However, to distinguish between a relationship with an attribute and entity, the rectangle representing the attribute is associated with the relationship using a dashed line. That's all for now, and see you again in the next part. Thank you.